Hi, everyone. Oop. Hi, everyone. Welcome to Food Talk Live. I'm Danny Nierenberg, president of Food Tank. I'm so excited to continue our discussions around the Refresh Working Group's Food Plus Tech policy platform, which has 5 pillars, including physical and digital food security, data protection, supply chain transparency, broadband expansion, and a digitally skilled workforce. Our previous live streams and the platform itself are available at foodtank.com. The Refresh Working Group is a multi-stakeholder platform made up of farmers, academics, entrepreneurs, chefs, advocates, technologists, and other experts who really wish to explore the complex intersection of agriculture, food, and technology. My co-host, Chloe Sorvino, who leads coverage of food and agriculture at Forbes, is joining me this week to ask our experts about creating a digitally skilled workforce. That's our theme for today. We've heard a lot this week about the need for more transparency around technology and how it is developed and used and how it is implemented. We've heard about the need for respecting communities and their own knowledge. We've talked about how farmers and workers all need more respect, and that's why I'm really thrilled for our discussion today. Many innovations in the food system are addressing challenges in the food, challenges that go from reducing waste to increasing food security. But many so-called technological advances can entrench existing inequities that can further marginalize communities who are already challenged by the digital divide. More than ever, we need to have a participatory design process in place that ensures that end users of a product are part of the process from beginning to end. And we need to look at the unintended consequences and impacts that technologies will have on food and farm workers, as well as others along the supply chain. So to look at some of these challenges and hopefully also some opportunities, we have a really great panel of experts. I'd like to give them all 30 seconds to introduce themselves. Sadly, Dr. Sibi, Restaurant Opportunity Center United, had a family emergency and can't join us today. But again, we have a great group. And so, Jose, I'm wondering if you can go first.
Absolutely. Hi, everyone. Good afternoon or morning if you're in the West Coast. Jose Oliva, I'm the campaigns director for the Heal Food Alliance. I'm also the former co-director, co-founder of the Food Chain Workers Alliance, which is one of the founding anchor organizations of the Heal Food Alliance.
Thank you so much. Neza, would you like to go next?
Yeah, thank you. So I'm Nessa Shitakutli. I'm the general coordinator of the Farm Worker Association of Florida. We are, of course, based in Florida, and we are also members of the Food Chain Workers Alliance and the Heal Food Alliance.
So great to have you here. Thanks so much. Kevin, how about you go next?
Sure. I'm Kevin Kruger. I run a global micro kitchen programs for Facebook, where we provide drinks and snacks for users across all of our global campuses. I'm also a member of the Refresh Food and Tech Working Group. And up till now, I've been working in food procurement, supply chain sustainability for about 15 years.
Thanks so much. And last but not least, Chris.
Hi, everybody. My name is Chris Ramsroop. I'm an organizer with Justice, or Justicia for Migrant Workers. We're also members of the Food Chain Workers Alliance. Justice for Migrant Workers is a volunteer activist organization, and I've been working with, we call them temporary foreign workers, but y'all call them guest workers and undocumented farm workers for about 20 years now.
So glad to have you. So Chloe has been so great this week to co-moderate. I'm going to pass it over to you now.
It's been so fun. Thank you so much. So we're here today to talk all about the ways that technology impacts workers across the food system. These workers have always been essential, though unfortunately it took a pandemic for too many Americans to have that wake-up call. Technology always brings up questions of trust, access, and ownership, but when it comes to a digitally skilled workforce, I think this is even more important. Social media can be a groundbreaking organizing tool, but at the same time, as Danny already mentioned, things like AI and automation threaten to widen inequities that are already too deep in so many parts of society. So with that, I'd love to kick off this panel by asking each of our panelists, what are some ways that technology is moving forward in the fight for justice in food? And what are some ways technology is hindering the fight for food justice? Jose, Chris?
Sure, I can get the ball rolling. I think you could ask the folks that are closer on the ground, Chris and Nessa on this panel, to verify what I'm about to say. But my sense is that there isn't a single worker out there who's saying, I really love bending down 12 hours a day, picking strawberries. I hope they never invent something that can do that for me, right? Everyone that I know, including myself, I was a restaurant worker for about 20 years before I started to do this, would love to have some kind of technology help support, even replace them. The question is, you as a worker are living off of that, right? And that is not only your livelihood, but in many cases, it's your identity. It is what you do because you love it, right? You love this. You love the food system. You love service. You love whatever it is, right? Whichever sector you're in. And so unless the technology is actually looking at it from a human perspective and not from just a capitalist perspective of how we're going to make money off of this, I think we're eventually going to go down the path of having a huge amount of people who are unemployed. And if we do have jobs in the tech sector repairing the robots that are flipping the burgers, that are picking the fruit, that are doing all of that, that those jobs are not going to go to the people who are currently in the food system right now, right? And so that disconnect is what needs to be repaired before we go too much further down this path that we're already on, right? And it's already a disconnect. No one has called me from the tech world, or no one has called any of my colleagues in the union and worker center world to talk about how do we make sure that the workforce is incorporated into this new vision of the future food system.
Yeah, I think that's a really great point, and that's one of the things that I see from the buyer side of the supply chain is I think along with increasing awareness of some of the conditions that farm workers are operating under, there's an assumption I see in many cases that technology will just improve that, will be a fix. Well, the term I keep hearing is, technology won't displace people. It'll displace the parts of their job that are dull, dirty, and dangerous, right? And that's like this incredible, noble goal. But I'm not convinced that just left to their own devices, market forces will make that happen, right? And will make sure that we're creating better jobs alongside this technology. So that's something I think about a lot from my perspective, is if someone's pitching us something, they want to come in and show us their cool new technology. It's where's the people element, and we need to be asking that from our side too.
For us in Canada, but particularly in Southwest Ontario, there's this inherent contradiction. And every time I do a talk, I basically try to say, what peeps are telling me. And I had a group of farm workers who work at a multi-million-dollar greenhouse in the Windsor, Essex area. Windsor's just outside of Detroit. Send me pictures this morning of chemicals basically all over the greenhouse, stuff that they have to breathe in. And this isn't a small mom and pop operation. This is a highly computerized, lots of AI. So this inherent contradiction where, yes, research and development money is going, first of all, towards enhancing and building up agriculture, but the working conditions still represent the 18th or 19th century. One of the conversations that we're not having is, if we're talking about increasing agricultural and making it more with artificial intelligence and robotics and automation, how do we improve worker standards? In both the United States and Canada, across jurisdictions, we continue the same things. It's illegal for farm workers to form unions. In most states or most provinces, farm workers don't have a right to overtime pay or holiday pay. racialization, how Black and brown workers are stereotyped, position what jobs they do within agriculture are still critical. So how do we unpack racism? How do we unpack the exclusions, the legislative exclusions to deny worker basics rights? And the other component, just what Jose is talking about, is this GameStop thing that's been going on. I was not aware about it, but it has had me to think a lot about capitalist production. And just once again, to close off about with this greenhouse industry, the transformation that's been happening across the greenhouse industry is a lot of the fruits and vegetables have been transformed, those crops, into cannabis. There was a bust in cannabis, which means that 3 million acres of greenhouse are just laying bare here, which should be used for food production. And our food system should not be at the whims of the stock market. And I think in correlation and connection with improving standards, this is the other part of the conversation that we need to have.
And something I wanted to add is that we're also seeing with this increasing mechanization and our food system being at the mercy of the stock market and profit-driven agriculture, is that we're also seeing an intensification of production. And at least here in Apopka, where I am calling from today, there are some cucumber farms just outside of town, and we're seeing just such an intensification in the packaging of cucumbers that they don't necessarily go to restaurants around here or products. They actually go to pickles, which get packaged and get sent overseas and all over the United States and all parts of the world. But as we're seeing this greater intensification, we're seeing also an increase in susceptibility to heat-related illness among farm workers. And it's, I think it's a byproduct that we may not have even been considering, just what it's doing to workers' health. But I wanted to also touch on some of the positive things that we're also seeing on the technology side, is that some workers are now using their smartphones to monitor their hours, and so that's actually helping reduce cases of wage theft, because they can keep better track of their hours, and they're also better able to monitor the temperature around them, so they know I mean, it's not the case in Florida, but I know that it is the case in California and Washington State, where you can actually take a break if the temperature reaches a certain temperature. So those are some positive things that we're seeing.
Thank you. Danny, before you ask the next question, I just want to say anecdotally, I'm really glad that the discussion's already going here. I interview agribusiness owners across the different sectors, and labor has only ever been framed to me from an owner as a problem and tech as the solution, but never with the human side of the solution as part of that. And so I'm really glad that that's what we're going to be digging into here, because we need to make sure that the jobs are there for the folks who've been dedicating their lives to this. So thanks, Danny.
Absolutely. Thank you all. And thanks, Neza, for bringing some positive ways that technology is being used. I think that's such an important part of this. It's an important part of organizing, which is what so many of you do. And I want to just ask a question about how the last year, how it's been, to be able to organize during the pandemic. It's made all of your jobs much more difficult, whether you're talking to workers in fields or trying to arrange, certain demonstrations or boycotts if necessary. So if one or two of you could talk about what it's like to organize during the pandemic and what that's meant, for your daily lives.
I can start again. It's been obviously, and Chris and Nessa can tell you again, they're much closer to the ground than I am, being in a national coalition, right? But what we have heard from our members, right, from the different organizations that represent workers in the various sectors of the food system, is that it's really impacted them in three very specific ways. One is the obvious health impact, right? And the fact that workers are much less likely to be in a position to want to meet with other workers because of the implications of the danger of being in a room full of people after you've been at work, for 8 to 12 hours in a room full of people, unless you're a farm worker when you're outdoors, right? But most other workers are indoors somewhere. So that's one way that it's made it a lot more difficult. The second way is that there's been a compounding of problems, right? So during the Trump administration, we've seen this very intense immigration enforcement policy here in the U.S. I'm obviously not speaking for Chris in Canada, right? But here in the U.S., we saw this really intense application of immigration laws, and that has terrified workers. And then COVID on top of that has created sort of a layered level of fear in the community. People who I know personally who just don't want to leave their homes at all. They are terrified of leaving. Now, some of that has eased post-election, but there's still a fear. And then the third part of COVID, I think that has impacted a lot of the organizations that we work with, is that it has made everything is about COVID. And even though food workers are called essential workers, that none of the it's a meaningless sort of performative label that hasn't meant an increase to wages or an increase or an improvement to working conditions, and it certainly hasn't even meant an actual personal equipment or any other ways of protecting themselves from COVID. And so those things, I think, have been the biggest factors in the whole sector overall over the course of the last year.
Thank you so much. Does anyone else want to comment on that?
So I think it's both, just to follow up with what Nessa said earlier, most of our work has been remote. And with the farm workers, and particularly the guest workers or temporary foreign workers, you've seen a lot of more both fear, but also resistance. So when their workers are put into quarantine here, for instance, and they've been getting a lot of really bad abusive treatment, many of them gone to social media, many of them asked through WhatsApp or through Messenger or other multiple platforms for us to get their messages out for them. They've been taking a lot of pictures of the horrific housing conditions that they've been subjected to. And we've been able to organize and use those as organizing opportunities to try to put forward issues that workers want to raise, and we've done that, today, and we continue to do so. So that's been one important thing around COVID organizing that we've seen, and I've always seen that the people who face the most or have the most to lose also take the greatest risks. And particularly during COVID, what we're seeing here is that there have been multiple wildcat strikes undertaken by farm workers, both around COVID conditions, as well as around pesticides and chemicals, around housing conditions. So in spite of knowing that workers could be banned permanently from working in Canada for standing up for the rights, we've seen a kind of a plethora, a real kind of outburst of this happening on multiple locations across the province and across Canada. So that's really, really critical. And I agree with Jose. This idea, the mythology of the essential worker, when we think about them as particularly health professionals, we celebrate health professionals, but the voices of farm workers or anybody across the food chain workers are silenced. And in fact, I would say that the workers were not just denied, health and safety protections or improvements around wages, but in fact that we've seen a decrease. And I could say with all the deductions, for instance, that guest workers have to pay to come to work in Canada, they're in fact making less than minimum wage to work here, as opposed to other workers. So there's been both positives, but COVID, I guess, has exposed the nakedness of the agricultural industry as itself and how lopsided it is in favor of agricultural business at the expense of workers.
Absolutely, so many cracks that COVID has exposed that were already there. But I mean, you've all talked about this lack of respect. I mean, to be an essential worker and not be treated with the respect that you deserve, I think these are real issues that we have not figured out how to grapple with yet. Does anyone else want to comment? I didn't want to cut anybody off. Neza, do you want to go ahead?
Yeah, I wanted to add that also during the outset of the pandemic and during the Trump administration, for all the former president's rhetoric about immigrants, he expanded the H-2A guest worker program in the United States. And that was one of the challenges we faced as farm worker organizing organization, because so it's more difficult to get to those guest workers and have conversations with them. And but I also wanted to speak of some of the opportunities that presented themselves for organizing, because as Chris and Jose were saying, there wasn't many of these workers were not being offered the same protections that other workers, and neither did they have the privilege of actually working remotely. And also, I'm going to take this opportunity to uplift the work of the rest of my organization, because many of our organizers were actually on the ground and were talking to these workers, offering them face masks and gloves and sanitizer, and they just took those opportunities to actually talk to them, and they were also putting themselves at risk.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much. I mean, I think those are great stories to share. Chloe, do you want to go next?
Yeah, we're digging into all this, so I want to keep going with that. So when jobs are created, what resources do workers need so that technology can benefit them as well as employers? And what organizations are supporting skill training for food chain workers right now?
So before my fire alarm goes off again, apparently there's a fire alarm test going on at the same time I'm doing I guess an international conversation. I want to get back to what Neza said earlier. And, I think across the continent, there's been a conversation about guest workers or H2 workers, and in Canada, temporary foreign workers, and how do we resolve it? In Canada, and we've been talking both through HEAL and the Food Chain Workers Alliance about the demands here in Canada. What we are seeing in Canada is that both undocumented or non-status communities and guest workers should have access to permanent residency. So people should come to Canada with status upon arrival. So why? Oops, sorry, very quickly before it goes off. Sorry, just really quickly, that's the first part, is how do we change our immigration laws so people could actually access the skills that are necessary, which won't happen as long as we treat workers as expendable.
I think that's an extremely fair point. Does anyone else have anything else to add there? Any other organizations?
That's the one thing that I would add, and this is echoing both Chris's point and Kevin's point from earlier about how technology can impact and how regulation or how the market, leaving things just to the market is not enough. The ADA, the Americans with Disabilities Act, was passed in 1990. That was 30 years ago. Most restaurants did very little in terms of setting up ramps or just making the restaurants accessible to people with disabilities. COVID happened and restaurants were shut down. And in most cities, they were told you can reopen, but you have to have certain things like shields and face masks, and you have to separate the tables 6 feet apart. Not a single restaurant has had a problem reopening and getting with the quickness, setting that up, right? So the market and the urgency of the reality of the regulations, the laws that were put in place, combined to make it possible for those changes to happen, right? So if you look at ADA side by side with the regs that happened in most cities around COVID, you realize that what was missing with ADA and what I'm proposing that needs to happen more with technology moving forward is that we have a sense of urgency and that we put regulations, laws in place that make it impossible for those businesses to function unless they are doing X, Y, and Z, right? And that X, Y, and Z is something that workers are at the table to help provide input on what that is, right? What is it exactly that we need in order for us to be in this new workforce that is emerging, right?
Absolutely. I'm wondering, Bernie, who is my co-founder behind the scenes, can we go back to Amber Lane's comment, please? So I'm just going to read it for the people who are listening, and then if everyone can comment, that would be great. What is it going to take for leaders, in quotes, to step aside to let Indigenous peoples and migrant workers, marginalized people step forward and be able to bring solutions and innovations for a system overhaul that benefits us all? Thank you, Amber. Great question.
So
Go ahead, Chris.
before I get to that point, I just also wanted to add previously around race and de-skilling. It's not a coincidence that you see occupational segregation, where you've got these racialized workers who are being denied access to skills. And it's not just because the workers do not want skills, is whether it's immigration restrictions or work restrictions, deny agricultural workers the ability to upgrade or to even consider trying to do other forms of occupations within the agricultural industry. They're continuing to be seen and designated as simply as workers when no longer needed as quote unquote low skill, then they're gone. Now, with respect to the second question, I don't think it's going to ever be about playing nice with big business or with people with power. If Indigenous and racialized and migrant communities need a space, they're going to have to take it. And I think that's pretty clear. What we've seen during COVID, particularly, is the reinforcement of paternalism and racism, where everybody will speak for the communities. And very much, and I am 100% sure this is happening in the United States, it is happening in Canada, whenever issues emerge around COVID and agricultural workers, it's only the employer lobby that's taking seriously. It's the employer's voice is what comes to represent the entire industry. And we've got to do a lot more kicking, pushing, and organizing. And for both of our political situations right now, with y'all having Biden and the new administration, and here having a quote unquote liberal government in Canada, it poses a series of sets of challenges for us in the sense of trying to push a progressive or a radical agenda. We have to ensure that we can't lose the space to push more now, and to be told that we need to just put up and be quiet.
Anyone else want to comment on Amber's great question? Neza, any thoughts?
Well, I just wanted to add that, right at the beginning of the pandemic, I think we saw an opportunity to actually uplift more localized food systems. And I think it's like, maybe it's not a lost opportunity. It didn't roll out the way I think would have been ideal, but I think it showed us what we're capable of doing, and I think it's something that we can just latch on to and try to fight for, because I think, like what Amber was saying, that's what we need to do. We need to build a localized food system with people on the ground imparting knowledge from the ground up.
Absolutely. Those local and regionalized food systems have saved us in so many ways during COVID, all of us, but it's the farmers and indigenous peoples and others who have really been doing the work to make that happen. Chloe, if you don't mind, I want to go back to something Jose said at the beginning, where Jose, you talked about, no worker really loves this back-breaking work of, being, picking all day. It's very difficult work. It's very laborious. But we also want to recognize that the culture and the skill set behind that work. I've worked on farms. I don't have the same skill set as a tomato picker in Florida. That's a very, it's a hard job, and you have to know how to do it well. As we talk about this, what I'm hearing is that we need more respect for these folks who are doing this work. How do we create that, though? How do we get, the average consumer who's going to the grocery store or getting, groceries delivered via Instacart to understand what goes into that tomato or that, pickle or whatever other food that we're talking about?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of it has to do with the history of this country and how we end up with the workforce that we end up in those particular sectors, right? So, I don't want to go too far back, right? But the reality is that our food system is rooted in slavery, and it's rooted in systemic racism, and so that leads to, and on another program, I'm happy to go over exactly how that happened, but that leads to this devaluement of the work itself, right? The labor itself becomes less valuable than let's say being a nurse, right, or being something else, and there is no reason for that. There is no such thing as low skilled work in the food system, right? Anyone who's worked in the food system can tell you that it is not just laborious in terms of back-breaking hard work, but it takes skill. You have to know when something is ripe and ready for picking, or you have to know how to plant something. You have to know when you're serving someone in a restaurant, you have to know exactly how to do it. There's skill involved at every level in the food system, right? So there isn't a reason for us to not value it the same, other than systemic racism, right? That is the root cause of the devaluation of that particular labor that is present in our food system. Sorry, I'm not presenting a solution. You asked me for a solution. The solution is let's get rid of systemic racism.
Well, absolutely, and I mean, I think that is the sort of conversation we're trying to have here, because for so long these things were kind of covered up, and over the last year they have been uncovered, and in bigger ways. There were always groups like yours, there were always authors and farmers like Leah Penniman who were uncovering these things, but now they're exposed to a much wider audience. And what I fear and have feared since COVID began, and people have been paying more attention to the food system and the people who work in the food system along the whole entire value chain, from people in the field to truck drivers and others, is that we, once this is over and everyone is vaccinated, that we will go back to the way things were, and we will forget all of these things that we have learned, that we have seen. And I guess my question is, how do we not do that? And it's through having, discussions like this, online forums, it's through all of the organizing work that you're doing. But I really want to get to sort of a place where, how do we not go back? How do we convince policymakers not to go back? How do we convince, business leaders not to go back? Because there's a different way forward. You all are like outlining that right now. How can we move that, whether it's, a Biden or a Trudeau in power, or a more conservative government?
So just wanted to jump in what Jose said. In addition to slavery, we could talk about empire, and I'll get to that in a few minutes. But I think also, if we're going to talk about valuing workers, it's about ensuring workers have the space and the power to organize. So we transform the way, the devaluing, the de-skilling, and the racialization and racism that workers are facing. So first and foremost, the power to organize, the power to change our laws, and to make sure that workers' rights are reflected and enforced. And the third aspect is, changing this power imbalance that exists in agriculture and across the food chain, this continuing disempowerment through lobbying efforts, through political efforts, but also this narrative that workers don't matter. And I think that's what each one of us is committed to fighting for. It is a lifelong challenge and a lifelong struggle for us that I think we're also starting to impart now. We've learned from our generations of elders, and we are now helping to impart what we've learned from the past to our children. So I think if we have to start thinking more of a longer narrative and a longer history of resistance, it's critical. And why I bring up empire in this conversation. So with the migrant workers who come up to Canada, and same with the communities of the United States, many of us are a result of colonialism, of empire building. The reason why we are here in the North is because of what happened in the global South. Our agricultural industries have been imperiled because of what our free trade policies and global policies have undertaken. And we cannot forget, I guess, the resistance that people have undertaken to fight slavery, to fight empire building, and to also try to talk about humanity, right? How do we humanize, and how do we value the skill set that agricultural workers bring to the table?
Thank you so much. Any other thoughts?
Yeah, I think we have a huge responsibility, as all of us who participate in the food supply chain, between farm workers and the source and consumers. I think I've seen a lot of increasing awareness in recent years on things like farm worker conditions, which is incredible. And then, we talk a lot about how we can change consumer behavior. But I think sometimes it's easy to sort of slip into an assumption or act as though everyone in between those two is just kind of helpless and is subject to market forces. And well, we just buy the things that our customers demand. So, we're really just kind of a middle person. But there are these tremendous leverage points all along the supply chains, right? With distributors, with program managers. I worked for Whole Foods Market for a long time, and I got to go to a lot of, small, local, regional, really interesting farms. It actually wasn't until I left Whole Foods Market and started working with some more conventional supply chains that I went to California and walked around in the Salinas Valley for the first time, and literally just got out and saw what it was like working in those fields. I mean, just impressive, right? I mean, incredible. I could never do the things that all those people do every day. And I think that's, it's easy for us as supply chain participants to get very distanced and to just look at these numbers and we're just placing orders. And I think we really have a responsibility as buyers to step in and to go and see what's actually happening, not just listen to the marketing points, not just listen to what our suppliers are telling us conditions are like. Once we see it, then we can't, you can't walk away from that and just not think about those people once you've seen them in action.
Thank
One of the
you.
things I wanted to also, oh, sorry.
No, go.
One of the things I just wanted to respond with Kevin, I think the previous part of the question is for us not to think of ourselves as consumers. And I know this might be a different way of thinking, but as community members, right, as residents, as people engaged in democratic principles, the idea is about this purchase idea, right? We think of ourselves as buyers and sellers. But what do we think about active civic engagement, about trying to ensure that everybody has a possibility to democratically participate, to improve our conditions of a food system? So that's one of the things that I've been trying to reflect on organizing with workers. We create a structure where workers are politically, economically, civilly, socially disenfranchised intentionally. How do we break that? And how do we actually try to find a way for people in our communities, whether in urban centers and workers, could come together to not only improve conditions, but also to rethink what our food system needs to be like?
Thanks. This is just so great. And Nez, I would really love to hear from you on this, honestly, because I'd love to hear more about how this has impacted tomatoes. I really want to be optimistic here, but to Danny's point earlier on the consumer aspect of all this, Tomatoland came out years ago, and we've known for years that there have been human rights abuses on these farms. And to the point about what's been happening recently, we know that Immokalee was one of the huge hotspots this past year during the pandemic. And I've known so many people that this winter were still, going to buying industrialized tomatoes, and they say that they're fans of the local food movement. So how have you seen this happening with tomatoes? Because it does seem like a consumer product, which kind of toes the line of still having a huge amount of consumer demand for the industrialized products, which we've known for years have issues with them.
Well, I think one of the advantages of the moment we're living is, I don't know if it's an advantage, but something we can take advantage of is we're more interconnected with technology, and so I think it's a good way to actually build that message and make other campaigns, more localized campaigns, aware of what we're doing, even if we're across the globe from where they are. And so I feel like the global food market is so entrenched in everything we consume, but I think it's also gives us the opportunity to also resist it and fight it using that same technology, by using that interconnectedness of the world to make each other aware of our fights and also of our knowledge, our traditional knowledge that we have about agriculture and how we can build a more, to go back to the localized food system. So I know, for example, that now we are working on getting some of our, we have community gardens as part of the organization, and one thing we're trying to do, and to touch back on Chris's point, some of the people who form part of these gardens are Hispanic or Latino or African American or Haitian, and so these are all different groups that are of colonialism, and just being able to communicate and transmit that knowledge. It's, sometimes we maybe at another time we would have to rely less on technology, but now we're actually using that technology to communicate better, not just with our neighbor who may be from another country or who may speak a different language, but we're also being able to share that knowledge from people elsewhere in the state and elsewhere in the country and on the other side of the world. So I don't know if I answered your question.
It's a hard one to ask. I also honestly would be curious to hear more about how organizing has honestly changed as it relates to workers through the pandemic. And Jose, I know we've spoken a fair amount about worker centers and organizations that are a bit more entrenched in communities. Are worker centers supporting skill training for digital right now? And then how is that working?
Yeah, before I answer that question, I wanted to just quickly go back to something that in your previous question and connect it to something that Kevin said.
Please,
around purchasing, because I do think there are some really great examples of both technology and policy innovations that, when connected to organizing, especially, and when connected to the realities of our food system, we can see some really positive outcomes. We've been working on good food procurement policies for years now. And those policies, they have 5 value categories around human health, environmental sustainability, animal welfare, local economies, and labor, of course. And the idea is that we originally had when we started to craft these policies was that they would serve sort of as a filter for large institutions, right? So these were things like public school systems, right? And here in Chicago, we're buying upwards of $300 million worth of food every year. And so if you have a filter for that food and you're saying you have to meet these 5 value categories in order for you to be able to sell food to this gigantic market, you're going to start to move the entire food system in the direction of better food, right? The problem is that there's a lack of transparency there, right? And so the school district doesn't even know themselves like where the food comes from, right? Because Aramark won't tell them, and Aramark won't tell them because Aramark says, well, that's proprietary information, right? That's our information to know, and we can't tell you because then we'll be at a disadvantage, a market disadvantage with Sodexo and Compass Group, which to me all sounds like a rational market argument, but in reality, it's just an excuse for them to continue to use the exploitative, extractive food system that we currently have, right? Because if they really cared about human rights and about the well-being of animals and about our environment, they would make that data available. They would take out the price point, they would take out the information that they didn't want their competitors to have and share the data that was relevant. So that's where technology comes in, right? Can't we come up with a way for technology to sort of meet us halfway and really be able to make those food systems as transparent as possible so that we're not in this position of having to guess where our food comes from? And this is not just any food, right? This is the food that our kids are eating in school or in the park district programs in the summer, that kind of thing.
Yeah, and just to interject, to add to that, I can say from experience that we as supply chain participants do not have to accept answers like we can't tell you. A lot of people, I think that's the path of least resistance, right? There are these long established supply chains that are just really easy to continue along with. But if we put out RFPs, if we put out bids for business, and we put in the language that we're going to require this type of transparency and these types of efforts, we have a lot of, there are a lot of us in the supply chain who have significant leverage, and sometimes they don't seem to realize it. But companies are not going to look at that and say, well, okay, I guess we just don't want your, like you said, your Chicago's $300 million worth of business. We absolutely don't have to just kind of accept the status quo and say, well, this is how the companies are doing things.
I'd like to go back for a moment. Thank you so much, Kevin. I'd like to go back for a minute to what Chris said about thinking of ourselves less as consumers and more as community members. And as Food Tank learned this term from the Center for a Livable Future called citizen eater. And I think if we can create a cadre of citizen eaters who care about where their food comes from, care about the people who produced and picked it and harvested it and served it and did all the things along the supply chain, that we can make some progress. But getting back to the policy platform, some of the recommendations that were made in the Refresh Food Plus Tech policy platform around a digitally skilled workforce are workforce training, because jobs, as Jose said earlier, some of these jobs do need to change, in terms of the backbreaking labor, but they also have to respect the cultural skills and history that is brought to that. There needs to be more business training for workers in lots of ways. There needs to be that digital skills training. All of you are doing that through your organizing, having folks use their smartphones or even their flip phones to document things. I think that's incredible. But I think one of the final recommendations that we made is this idea of community partnerships and participatory design. And this is something that we've been talking about all week: participatory design. Having workers involved, instead of being these end users who are given a tool and say, hey, use this, it will make your life easier, to have workers involved at the beginning of when innovations and technology are developed. And that's, that sounds great. That sounds great to me, but I don't know how we do that. That requires businesses to really get on board. And from my perspective, it requires unions, farm worker unions, food worker unions, to really be allowed to organize in a way where they can influence that. And I'm wondering, it's not really a question. I'm just wondering if some of you can comment on that. Jose, I always pick on you. Chris, go ahead, whoever.
Yeah, I'll just responding, I guess, in 4 different ways. So for undocumented and for guest workers in Canada, if there is training, it should be paid training. It should be not off the time, right? But it should be on the workplace time, and it should be considered part of work. And the federal and provincial governments here in Canada have to be investing in providing support for precarious people with precarious immigration status to have access to education. And international students, for instance, pay exorbitant rates, both in Canada and the United States. That is insulting, to say the least. But you have huge swaths of population, huge groups of population who don't have access to any form of education. In Canada, if you're a guest worker, it's actually forbidden for you to attend post-secondary education if you're working in agriculture. So stuff like that immediately has to end. We also, you talked about unionization, right? So how do we ensure there's workplace democracy to start talking about the transition? So whether it's health and safety committees or other venues in the workplace to ensure that there's equal decision-making about how technology and artificial intelligence, robotics are used. That's the second component of part this. And the third is to end this paternalism that's been ongoing, where you're imposing technology and automation on workers without any understanding of the consequences it will have for them. And sorry, the final point, and I'm sure you're seeing the same thing that we're seeing this, is around wage theft when it comes to broadband and use of internet. We have a lot of employers who are wage gouging the workers for use of internet use. And I think for particularly our communities in rural settings, the notion and idea for a universal broadband is critical to ensure that they have access to talk to their families, to alleviate the stress they're facing, being so far away from their families, working in the global north. It's kind of a contradiction. It's this hypocrisy that the people of the global north cannot provide the most basic necessities of broadband service to help the most marginalized people.
That is such a great point, and it is one that we discussed earlier this week on this need for rural broadband expansion, not just for farmers, but for farm and food workers. So thank you so much for bringing that up. Chloe, back to you.
I'd only add here that a workforce will, I think, really only change as much as the ownership changes. We've been talking about unions, but the other thing we didn't talk about is the history of racist financing in this country and loans to farmers. And unions and worker centers do give workers a seat at the table, but I'd love to hear from more of the panelists about the perspectives on how other ownership can change and how the economic system can change from a more foundational perspective in terms of co-op ownership or other alternatives.
I want to touch back on what I think Chris mentioned earlier, and the need for seeing ourselves more as members of a community, and I think that's where ownership needs to come from. People seeing themselves as part of the community, and the land and the means of that production are part of the community, not of any one individual. And so, I mean, I think that's going to definitely need a lot of work on our part to make sure this happens, but and a lot of advocacy for more community-based policy decisions. But I think it's something that it's worth doing, and we're going to need all the help we can get to do this, not just from people who have the connections and the knowledge on how to advocate for policy, but also the knowledge of the people on the ground who know who can envision, because they have seen it, they have lived, how a community can work together.
I think the idea about cooperatives is so important. It's beautiful. It addresses two things. It addresses the continued idea that when farming is in crisis, and that farmers, when they retire, they don't know who's going to take it on. And number two, it's about addressing this ever growing corporate agricultural structure. Now, getting to your point about racism. So for myself and all these workers that I've known have been working 30, 40 years. And once they are done, they're basically told, we no longer need you. But they've got so much values and skills. How do we start thinking about developing a different system, right? Providing the opportunity for workers to develop cooperatives, right? Having them to have the ability for land, the investments, all the necessary tools to ensure their skills could be valued. So I think for many of us, there's some small groups that are doing it, but for many of us, it's still kind of a theoretical conversation rather than the practical. And I want to see, how do we move to the practical component to respect all that the workers have been putting forward for so many decades?
Yeah, so maybe this is beating a dead horse, but I want to crystallize the theme that is coming out from both Nessa and Chris, and that is that ownership structure matters. It's not just about having more Black and brown people owning things. If they're going to replicate the exact same system that we have now, right? What difference is there then for a worker working for a Latinx boss than it is for working a white boss? It's the same thing, right? So I think that the key there is the structure. And I think what Nessa and Chris are both saying is that if the ownership is rooted in the community, right? In other words, if it is either owned as a cooperative or owned by the community, or somehow that the community feels the investment of it, then the benefits are going to come to the community, and they're going to be some vested interest, like, let's not pollute because that's not good for our community, right? Like that kind of thing. So I think it's critical to not just say, oh, ownership is more important, like we need to have more BIPOC ownership, Black, Indigenous, people of color ownership. It's not as simple as that, right? It's about the structure of the ownership.
For sure. And I think it's also about like community banks, right? Community where like loans can stay in communities and go towards communities. I think that's a really interesting model that's come up. And we also talked about public utilities as well earlier in the week. So Danny, I'll turn it over to you, but I just wanted to end the thought on that. I think there's just a lot of ownership structures that people aren't thinking about that really could be thought about, especially as we're going into this, kind of brave new world. And I think anything's really possible.
Thank you so much, Chloe. Nikki Rose just had a great comment that was that we need to look outside the USA and North America, Chris, for programs and cooperatives to understand what works elsewhere. And I think that's such a great comment and really constructive, because there are these examples of cooperatives that are worker owned that work really well, that, one of you mentioned, and I'm sorry, I forget, I think it was Chris, farms are in crisis right now. And farmers don't know, who's going to take over the farm, who's going to take over that land. So if we can build these structures now and have them in place so that there's a plan. And I think that's what we've been missing for so long, is an actual plan about how to deal with our land, with our environment, with the workers who work that land, and protect and steward our natural resources. So this has been such a lively discussion. Bernie, on the backside, at the very beginning, Ursula King had, I think, what was a really great comment. So I'm wondering if you can bring that up. She had several, but it was at the very beginning. If you can't bring it up, that's okay. I think so many of the folks who have been watching have had wonderful comments and really great resources to provide. So let me just read it for the people who are listening. The panelists believe technology should be focused in order to make improvements for workers, ideas for specific technologies that would be helpful in different food sectors. And I think this is kind of a great point to end on. If we can, just talk very briefly about very specific things that you think will work. We've talked about, the use of smartphones and that kind of thing, but are there other technologies that you think would specifically help workers?
I said it a little bit earlier, but I think anything that adds to transparency of the supply chain. I want to know where exactly this meal that I'm eating came from, but I also want to know what the working conditions were in the places that touched it along the way, right? Not just this tomato is from Florida. Great, that's good to know, but right, like what were the working conditions for those pickers, and what were the working conditions for the warehouse workers and the folks that packed it and delivered it or whatever, right?
I think there's some great technologies coming out that are giving us opportunities to decentralize. And you think about just, robotic smoothie machines and a lot of these things that allow us to distribute, improve the quality of what we're serving. But, and it's still everything that goes in, it still has to be prepared by a person, right? And it needs to be serviced. And so it allows us to kind of spread out, make food fresher, more accessible at more points, but creating those better jobs. And so it's, it's a person who's prepping things in a well equipped facility, in good working conditions, and then it's the robot that's like during the rush just trying to produce as many smoothies as it possibly can. But there's some really interesting integrations coming there.
And go ahead, Neza.
Yeah, I think Jose mentioned something similar, or maybe this is it, but I just want to bring it up again. I think education should go towards training workers so that they are not displaced by new machines and new technology, so that they can become the operators of those machines and find new ways to integrate those new skills into the food system.
Absolutely. Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Of course, Chris, go ahead.
I think as organizing tools, whether I guess if people use Signal and Telegram and they continue to use WhatsApp, those are going to be important spaces for resistance. It's going to be a way for us to try to organize, just to resist and to fight back, to expose what's happening. So you'll be seeing a lot more, I think, of that happening, particularly as the pandemic increases and post-pandemic. So I think that's the first thing. And I think just the principles we talked about, that technology needs to be developed with workers. None of us are going to be in a position to really say what will benefit workers without talking to the workers about how to improve those conditions. And that's only going to occur where we give the workers a space to speak out, to have protection, and to end the reprisals when they do speak out to try to change their working conditions.
That is the perfect point to end on. I'm so glad you talked about that. Thank you so much, Chris, Neza, Jose, Kevin. You are all fantastic speakers on the subject. Chloe, you're an excellent comrade in arms as a moderator. Thank you all so much for being here. I want to thank all of our listeners and viewers. These I think we got the most comments on this panel than all the others this week, so I really appreciate that. I hope everyone will come back tomorrow to join us for our final panel in this series at 2 p.m. Eastern on physical and digital food security. Thank you all again. Please stay safe, wear a mask, and I hope to see you in person soon.